In former times, the fear of body snatching or disinterment of the dead was so great that often in the neighborhood where medical students were pursuing their studies, persons who lost friends would have a watch kept over their graves for several nights to prevent them from being dug up. Neither the high social position of parties nor sex was any barrier to this desecration of graves, and the public mind was often shocked by accounts of the young and beautiful being disinterred to be cut up by medical students. In the winter of 1787 and 1788, medical students of New York City dug up bodies more frequently than usual or were more reckless in their mode of action, for the inhabitants became greatly excited over the stories that were told of their conduct. Usually, the students had contented themselves with ripping open the graves of strangers and blacks about whom there was little feeling. But this winter they dug up respectable people, even young women, of whom they made an indecent exposure. A mere accident caused this state of feeling to culminate and suddenly break out into action. In the spring, some boys were playing in the rear of the hospital when a young surgeon, from a mere whim, showed an amputated arm to them. One of them mounted a ladder that stood against the wall, used in making some repairs, when the surgeon told him to look at his mother's arm. The little fellow's mother had recently died, and filled with terror, he immediately hastened to his father. The father at once went to his wife's grave and had it opened. He found the body gone and returned to his fellow workmen with the news. They were filled with rage and armed with tools, and gathering a crowd as they marched, they surged up around the hospital. Threats and denunciations began to arise on every side, and then appeals for vengeance, till at length they rushed for the door and, pouring into the building, began the work of destruction. For a while there was a terrible rattling of bones as they tore down and smashed every anatomical specimen they could lay their hands on. They swarmed through the building and finally came upon fresh subjects, apparently, but just dug up. This kindled their rage tenfold. The news of the gathering of the crowd and its threatening aspect had reached the mayor, who immediately summoned the sheriff, and taking him with several prominent citizens, hastened to the spot. Finding the students in the hands of the infuriated mob, he released them, and to the satisfaction, apparently, of the rioters, sent them to jail for safekeeping. There was now nothing left for them to do, and they dispersed, and the matter was thought to be ended. But during the evening, lots of men were everywhere discussing the events of the day and retailing the exciting reports that were now flying thickly around. Next morning, whether from any concert of action is not known, crowds began to fill the street and yard in front of the city hospital. The discovery of the bodies the day before had deepened the excitement, and now a more thorough examination of the building was proposed, and also an examination of the physicians' houses. Matters were beginning to wear a serious aspect, and the governor, mayor, chancellor, and some of the prominent citizens of the town came together to consult on a course of action. It was finally resolved to resort to the spot where the mob was assembled and make a personal appeal to it. Mounting the steps, they in turn addressed the throng, which now kept momentarily increasing, and exhorted them as law-abiding citizens to use no violence. They promised that a most thorough investigation should be made, and they should have all the satisfaction the laws could afford. These appeals and promises produced a favorable effect on many of the mob, and they left, but the greater part refused to be pacified. Their blood was up, and they insisted on making the examination themselves. The mayor and the governor seemed to have an unaccountable repugnance to the use of force and let the mob depart for Columbia College without any resistance. Finding nothing to confirm their suspicions, they left without doing any material injury. Still unsatisfied, they repaired to the houses of the neighboring physicians and went through them with the same result. The mayor had hardly time to congratulate himself on having overcome so easily a serious difficulty before he found that he had not as yet touched it. In the afternoon, the crowd again began to assemble, and this time around the jail, with the avowed purpose of taking vengeance on the students and physicians locked up there for safekeeping. As they gathered in front of the jail, it was seen that a different spirit from that which they had hitherto exhibited ruled them. The tiger was unchained, and loud shouts and yells were heard. The inmates became thoroughly alarmed and barricaded the doors and windows and armed themselves the best way they could for self-defense. The city authorities now became alarmed. Murder was imminent, and having no police force sufficient to cope with such a formidable mob, they decided that the city was in a state of insurrection and called out the military. About 3 o'clock, the force marched up the street and passed quietly through the crowd, which opened as they advanced. The whole military movement was evidently intended only for intimidation, for the soldiers, instead of taking up their quarters in the building, having exhibited themselves, marched away. But the mob still retaining its position and threatening attitude, another force, a little later, consisting of only 12 men, was sent up. This was worse than nothing, and as the little handful marched solemnly up, the crowd broke out into derisive laughter, and all sorts of contemptuous epithets were heaped upon them. Instead of waiting for them to come near, they rushed down the street to meet them, and swarming like bees snatched away their muskets and broke them to pieces on the pavement. This first act of open resistance excited the rioters still more. They had passed the Rubicon and were now ready for anything. They rushed against the doors and with united shoulders and bodies endeavored to heave them from their hinges. But being secured with heavy bolts and bars, they resisted all their efforts. They then smashed in the windows with stones and attempted to force an entrance through them, but the handful of men inside took possession of these and, with such weapons as they could find, beat them back. The rioters, baffled in their attempts, would then fall back and hurl paving stones and bricks at the windows, when those who defended them would step one side. But the moment the former advanced again, the latter would crowd the windows with clubs and sticks. The fight was thus kept up till dark amid yells and shouts and a pandemonium of noises, and no efforts apparently were made to put an end to it. But steps had been taken to organize and arm a large body of militia under an experienced officer, and now in the dim starlight their bayonets were seen gleaming. The rioters, however, instead of being intimidated at the sight, sent up a yell of defiance, and arming themselves with stones and brickbats, hurled them in a blinding volley on the troops. The commanding officer, finding the fight thus forced on him, gave the order to fire. A flash followed, lighting up the gloom and revealing the scowling faces of the mob. They had not expected this close, point-blank volley, for the timid action of the authorities had not prepared them for it, and they stopped in amazement and hesitation. The commanding officer understood his business, and instead of waiting to see if they would disperse, poured in another volley. The rioters were confounded as they saw their comrades fall by their side, but still stood at bay until at last, seeing the dead and wounded on every side, they could stand it no longer, but broke and fled in every direction. In a few minutes the street was clear of all but the dead and wounded, the groans of the latter loading the night air. The poor wretches were carried away, and the troops remained on the spot all night. The next day the city was in a fever of excitement. The number of killed was greatly exaggerated, and the denunciations of the butchery, as it was called, were fierce and loud. The soldiers who had committed the slaughter were cursed and threatened by turns, but they quietly rested on their arms, ready to repeat the experiment at the first open act of violence. For a while, there was danger of a general outbreak throughout the city, but the authorities had become thoroughly aroused to the danger of the situation, and seeing that the quicker they brought the conflict to a close, the better. They made such a display of force that the riotous spirit was overawed. The physicians of the city came in for almost as large a share of the hatred as the military. They were the original cause of the disturbance, and threats against them became so open and general that they were in constant dread of personal violence, and many fled from the city. They scattered in every direction, and there threatened to be a general exodus of physicians. All the medical students were secretly stowed into carriages and hurried off into the country, where they remained till the excitement died away.